Good afternoon to everyone in the United States. Good afternoon to good evening to our friends and colleagues in Germany. And welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon for this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, President of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And we are particularly pleased to offer this program today, which focuses on the German election. I've said many times that this is the most important election happening in the world in the year 2021. And I think what we see as we observe the election race before the September 26th vote is a tightening race. By my rough calculation, there are at least 5 different possible coalition outcomes based on the current public opinion data. And I think that reflects the uncertainty about the outcome, the different possibilities for Germany's future government. And I think that's extremely interesting for people in the United States and around the world really, because of the important role Germany plays in global affairs. And we are especially pleased today to have some of Germany's leading experts on public opinion research and electoral behavior. So I'd like us to get right into it. And in order to do that, I'm going to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Senior Fellow and Director of our Society, Culture, and Politics program, Eric Langenbacher. Eric, please lead us on from here. And I'm really looking forward to the program.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And before we get going, I should note that we at AICGS are doing an election series. We have been all year. We have other events coming up. And we've been doing this in a wonderful partnership with the International Association for the Study of German Politics, with the Aston Center for Europe, with the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University, with very generous sponsorship from the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany to the United States. So we're about a month out from the election. It seems that things are starting to evolve in very interesting ways with the polling. And I'm really pleased that we have 3 top professionals to speak with us today about what's going on with the polls and what we might expect on September 26th on Election Day. So first we have Dr. Yvonne Schroth, who's the Managing Director at Forschungsgruppe Wahlen. And she's been there since the late 1990s, and she got her doctorate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Heidelberg. Then we're going to have Dr. Peter Matuschek, who's the Director of the Department of Political Research at Forza, Public Opinion and Polling Institute in Berlin. He's been responsible since 2007 for research projects on elections and public opinion polling. Previously, he was at the University of Göttingen and Potsdam, and also got his PhD from the University of Göttingen. And then third, we have Dr. Thorsten Faas, who's a professor of political science in the Otto Suhr Institute at the Free University of Berlin. He's been there since 2017. Previously, he was at the University of Mainz, as well as Mannheim, and he got his PhD from the University of Duisburg-Essen. So without further ado, we're going to have brief introductory remarks from our 3 panelists. After that, we will open it up to a moderated question and answer period. So I would ask all of our attendees, if you do have a question, please type it in the Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then I will read the questions off to our panelists. So without further ado, Dr. Schroth, you're up first.
So thank you, Jeff Rathke, Liz and Eric for inviting me. There is one word to describe the political mood during this campaign. And I would say the answer to the question, what is the data telling us, is volatility, or inconstancy, or impermanence. I don't know which concept describes the situation best. An accurate term in German is Unbeständigkeit. So why is this? We have a non-transferable starting point in this election because now incumbent is running again, and this is an historical uniqueness for Germany. And I will now give you a few examples to express the high volatility and the high uncertainty in the electorate. Next. We see here the projection since January 2020. This is the so-called Sonntagsfrage. Who would you vote for if there was an election next Sunday? And we are able to see the high approval for the Christian Democrats during the COVID pandemic, which was the time of the executive party. However, the SPD wasn't able to draw any profit out of the situation. Due to the high dissatisfaction with the vaccination campaign in March, April, and May, the values of the Christian Democrats go down, whereas the Greens are on to come up. They were, however, at the same point at 2019, so the Greens have a good start in the campaign. The political mood since then has been dominated by the candidate nomination of Armin Laschet and Annalena Baerbock and their mistakes in the election campaign. So the last polls show now a clear convergence of the Christian Democrats and the SPD, which are now almost on eye level. The SPD stood at 15% over the really last period of time, over months and over years, but now has increased up to 22 in the last 2 weeks. And at least we have 3 parties on an eye level, because the Greens are now at 20%, the Christian Democrats at 22, and the Social Democrats at 22 as well in our last poll last week. So in the States, you call it an October surprise if there is a huge swing in the political mood. So we have definitely in Germany an August surprise. And we have to wait for our next survey to see what impact the last TV debate has in the data. And it's to mention that there is a high percentage of undecided voters at the moment. Over 40% are undecided. Next, please. Next slide, please. Here's the rating of coalition models from last Friday, and I call it a coalition dilemma. The people have no idea what parties should govern together after the election. There is currently no coalition model favored by the majority, and that has not been the case for years. In the last 5 federal elections, at least one coalition was supported by the majority. The fact that there is now a certain perplexity about which party should work together is an expression of a great uncertainty about what will come after Merkel. Before the nomination of Laschet and Baerbock, a coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Greens, the so-called Black-Green coalition, was the most desired coalition models over years, and this has changed since June. Since then, all conceivable coalitions have been rejected by the majority. Now, according to our latest survey, only 27% favor a coalition of the Christian Democrats and the Greens. And we've all been taken by surprise that the coalition of the Social Democrats, Greens, and Liberals, the FDP, the so-called traffic light coalition, and the coalition of Social Democrats, Greens, and the left are now the best rated coalition models, whereas they have been the most rejected ones over years. Next. Here we are able to see the development of the question, yes, suitable for Chancellor from March till last Friday. And we see that 65% say, yes, Olaf Scholz is suitable for Chancellor. The first error shows the time of the nomination of Laschet and Baerbock, where Baerbock was conceived as best suitable for Chancellor. This has changed immensely, and because of her financial inconsistencies and the accusation of plagiarism of her book, and the immense negative framing in the center-right press of the person, Annalena Baerbock, and this caused really a crash in her ratings. The second error shows the time when Armin Laschet is photographed laughing during a speech of President Steinmeier addressed to flood victims. And his values are decreasing constantly, and at the end of August, only 25% consider him suitable for Chancellor, and Baerbock is considered even worse. Over the whole course of time, Olaf Scholz is considered to be better than his competitors, but his party stood at 50% in the polls for a long time. But now, however, he has increased immensely, and his party is now at the same level as the Christian Democrats, as we have seen before. But now we have to wait if there is any impact of the first TV debate in this question. Next. Here's the question, whom do you want as Chancellor? And if the Chancellor could be elected directly, Schulz would have had a clear lead over some times. And now 49% prefer Scholz and only 17% Laschet and 16% Baerbock. Next. Here's the Chancellor question broken down by party supporters, and surprisingly, almost 27%, about 1/3 of the Christian Democrats supporters want Scholz as Chancellor, and even 48% of the Liberal supporters and 49% of the AfD supporters prefer Scholz. So we can see that Scholz is backed above party lines. Next. Here we have the Chancellor question broken down by age groups, and Annalena Baerbock has the most support among young voters. However, the support has decreased significantly in favor of Scholz. 1 month ago, even more than 50% of young voters favored Baerbock. Laschet's lead among older voters also declined in favor of Scholz, but as we can see, we have a large group of don't know. So it's also an expression of a kind of helplessness in this election. Next, please. So here's the outcome of the general election. Is it already clear today who will win? And 85% say no. In comparison to August 4 years ago, there were 55% who say no. So there's a high percentage of uncertainty as how this election will turn out, especially in comparison to 4 years ago. Next. So now we have reached the end of my small presentation, and to conclude, there is a decoupling of Merkel and her party, Christian Democrats. We have this non-transferable starting point that no incumbent is running again, which causes the highest uncertainty as to who will win the election and the highest volatility in the electorate in the past 30 years. And there is no coalition preferred by a majority, which I called coalition dilemma. Merkel's rating is still excellent, and it seems that she's no longer associated with her party, which is in a much worse position. And at the beginning of the year, I said, whoever manages to convey confidence in a hands-on manner during the election campaign will win the election. The crisis pilot and the sense maker will win. And I said on a panel 4 weeks ago that none of the candidates can be ascribed with these attributes. But now we see that Olaf Scholz profits enormously from the weakness of his competitors, and he's the most likely candidate. But he has a kind of weak party behind him, and this could cause potential problems. But as well, his party profits from the poor performance of the Christian Democrats and the Greens, and not from their own strength. We have still 4 weeks ahead of us until the election, and it is still perceived as the $1 million question as to who will win. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, that was absolutely terrific. Next up, we have Dr. Matushek.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good evening or hello to everybody. I just said at the beginning that I hope we won't show the same figures, but I think I will make some additional remarks to what Yvonne Schroth just said. I would like to highlight one point which has already been mentioned before, that I also think that these federal elections are unique in many ways because of the special constellation we have with an incumbent who has been governing the country for 16 years, not running again, and all the consequences this entails. So I would like to start with the question, will we see the end of political stability that our party system has enjoyed for so many years and so many decades in these elections? And I would like to start as well, the next chart, with the development we've already seen. These are our numbers. Yvonne Schroth already mentioned it. We had a return of confidence, I would say, in the governing party, the major governing party during the Corona pandemic, which has already been mentioned. And this has changed. This changed considerably at the beginning of the year already, with the Christian Democrats falling below 30% in April, and especially I would like to highlight this moment when Armin Laschet, the now Chancellor candidate, was nominated by the Christian Democrats, who had already been done very weakly in the polls as a candidate. And then when he was nominated, having a much more attractive to the electorate, much more attractive competitor within his own ranks, Markus Söder, when he was nominated, at the same day when the Green candidate was nominated, the numbers for the Christian Democrats went down and the Greens managed to increase. So there was a sort of a double effect, which at that time did not affect the chances of the Social Democrats at all. So we had a clear competition rather between the two camps, the Christian Democrats and the Greens. And now on the next chart, what we see, we are polling every week. So I would like just to show the figures for the different parties per week. So we see the development, which is roughly what we've just saw before. But so then we had a point when the Green candidate lost confidence, Annalena Baerbock, and when people got a little bit more accustomed to Armin Laschet, the CDU candidate, and due to the mistakes by the Greens, the Christian Democrats recovered without this still affecting the fate of the Social Democrats. So this changed again, and I totally agree with this picture of a high volatility. This changed again with in week 30, when the SPD slowly won ground and managed to gain in the polls, and with the Christian Democrats losing considerably, even falling behind in our poll already in the last week for the first time since 2006, behind the Christian behind the Social Democrats, and with the Greens rather stabilizing now at around 18%. So on the next chart, I would like to go back for a second to the first part of the legislature, when we saw what we are asking every week is the so-called Chancellor Preference. Who would you vote for if you were able to vote to elect the Chancellor directly, which is a hypothetical question, but it shows who people really trust to become the leader of the country and to fill the office of the chancellery. And we saw this great lead of Merkel throughout all the years against any social democratic candidates that they were in these 16 years, with a small point when Schulz, the candidate in the last election, managed to even touch her in the polls, but this he lost ground very quickly. And even her successor, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, enjoyed considerable support when she was nominated as her successor in the party leadership, but then lost incredibly in a very short period of time. So on the next chart, what we see is the evolution of this year, as we already saw in the previous presentation. Very high level of volatility, I totally agree, with ups and downs of the different candidates, a short recovery of Laschet in the summer, the early summer, and a considerable decline in the last weeks. So if you look at this in a historic perspective, 11% who would elect a CDU candidate as a chancellor if they could vote for him directly is a historic low. And we also saw the surge of Scholz within the last couple of weeks, clearly leading this race. And this, if you ask for, well, what determines the outcome of an election or a party's fate in the election, of course, still and even more, every election, personality is important, as we saw in the past years already. But Scholz definitely helped the SPD to recover a little bit, although we have to say, I mean, 22-23% in a historic perspective is still very low for the Social Democratic Party. But however, the striking point is this this weakness of the Christian Democrats at this time being. On the next point I would like to mention is party competence, and this is why I think which explains the strength of the Christian Democrats throughout all the last years and the last elections was her advantage when we asked the question, who do you most trust to tackle the problems of the country? And what we see here is that it was the Christian Democrats with a high lead against all the other parties for a very long time, which helped her maintain her first position in the party system. Now, what happened, we see this on the next chart, what happened in the last months. So this has changed, and this is a very important point. The CDU still enjoys a lead when it comes to who do you most trust to tackle the problems in the country, but this lead has diminished considerably. She was at more than 40% who said this during the Corona crisis. Now they have come down to 16%, and the lead over the SPD and the Greens is very small. However, the SPD has not won more confidence in the eyes of the voters than the CDU is. The SPD as a party is still at 10%. So this explains why even this little boost they got with the nomination of Scholz or in the last weeks didn't really help them get more votes in the polls. With the CDU at 21-22%, one would expect the SPD to be in a much better position, which they are not. And so this is very interesting in this election that people we have a candidate of the Social Democrats who enjoys a considerable lead over the other competitors, but you still have the SPD as a party being viewed as a party who is not considered as the most capable of leading this country. So this is, let's say, a dilemma voters are facing and former SPD voters are facing when they have to make up their choice. The last point I would like to mention, so this is what everybody is asking for, the possible outcome of the election. We just saw that people are torn who they would prefer, which coalition. And I would just like to mention which coalitions are feasible at this moment, given the polls we have. So the striking feature is that no two-party coalition would be viable at this moment. So this would be something very new after these elections. Only a three-party coalition, whatever color blend would be possible, or either CDU, SPD and Liberals, Greens, SPD and Liberals, or the so-called Jamaica coalition, or even, although with a narrow margin, a left coalition. So this is what the picture looks like. And unless there is not a major shift in the polls, it is very likely that we will face a three-party coalition for the first time after the elections on September 26th. Thank you very much.
All right, excellent. And last but not least, Dr. Faas.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to talk to all of you about this fascinating election. Now, it's a kind of difficult position for me because a lot has already been said. And on top of that, I'm not a pollster, so I don't have any real fancy up-to-date data, but I nonetheless will try to provide maybe a little bit of context and focus on a couple of points. I will try to be brief because I see that there are already a number of questions in the Q&A, so I think we really should have some time for discussion, and hence I will try to be brief. Next slide, please. You have seen versions of this before. It's actually Forza Data collected by Manfred Göhner, Peter Matuschek, and others. It's just a different kind of presentation. Maybe it's 4 snapshots of the state of German politics within the last couple of years. I mean, that maybe we should keep in mind the tremendous shifts that we have seen in the 2 most recent years. They're really, really remarkable. And what we should keep in mind maybe, and maybe that's something that I should add to the discussion that we've heard so far, is that this so-called grand coalition of CDU, CSU, and SPD, they really had a rough start in 2017 and 2018. Their ratings, their approval ratings had been really, really poor. So if you look at the top left picture here, that's basically the time of the last European election. Back then, these 2 parties were in turmoil already, and this European election has been labeled kind of as a climate election, as a climate-dominated election, and the Greens back then have been the strongest party. And from there, we of course had the Corona pandemic and the upper right graph that you see here that led to a surge of the CDU-CSU up to 40%. I mean, that's a pretty classic Volkspartei catch-all party if you have 40% of the vote, with the Greens and the SPD at 15%. Then we're back basically, this is April 2021, the bottom left graph. The Greens, after nominating Annalena Baerbock, a huge euphoria, you could say, a huge outlook in a very positive way for the elections among Greens. They're back in first place. And now, of course, Peter has shown these figures. We are right now, this is actually data from today, basically, with the Social Democrats ahead, slightly leading the Christian Democrats and the Greens, 23, 21, 18%. So I guess Yvonne has said already, volatility is really all you can say about the state of German politics. And if you look, and maybe next point here, if you look at this, no, maybe go back once, thank you. If you look at the election year that we experience in Germany right now, if you recall the elections that we've had in the states of Baden-Württemberg, Rhineland-Palatinate, but also Saxony-Anhalt, we have seen volatility, last-minute swings, really all the way up to election day. Because, I mean, Peter has talked about the coalition dilemmas and Yvonne as well. But that, of course, triggers, at least among some people, the idea that maybe they should cast a strategic vote. And strategic voting, of course, takes place up until the very last second before election day. So this really, even the data from today, is a snapshot of current affairs, but we really, as of now, we don't know how this election will turn out. Of course, there's momentum for some candidates, for some parties right now, but we really don't know what's going to happen. And now we'll focus on one or two aspects around that in the next couple of minutes. Volatility we see on all levels. We have seen the candidate numbers and figures. I guess one should differentiate here between awareness of the candidates. I mean, keep in mind, Annalena Baerbock was really not a well-known politician all the way up until April this year. If you look at Infratest DMAP data, about 50% were able to state an approval of her work all the way up until March, April. So what we have seen with respect to her was just a rising awareness, which led to rising figures in the beginning. But with all these flaws and mistakes that she and her party has made, her image was not sort of well structured in the minds of the voters. So there was a lot of potential for lowering her figure, her approval ratings, and that's what we've seen. We have already heard a lot about Laschet and Scholz. So a lot of volatility on the personal level, given that we don't have an incumbent here. But we also have tremendous volatility on the level of issues. I mean, I mentioned the European election in 2019. That was dominated by the issue of climate change or energy politics, environmental concerns. After that, we have seen an absolute domination of the corona pandemic, with, as a consequence, a rise in the approval ratings of Merkel, of the government as a whole, but also for the Christian Democrats. But that was closely linked to a specific issue here. After that, we have seen flood disasters in the west of Germany. We see a re-emergence generally of questions of climate change, energy politics, but we also see rising importance for questions of taxation, redistribution. And I mean, just keep in mind, it matters, of course, what the issues are that dominate a campaign, because when we talk about competence ratings, they're of course very, very different depending on the topic, on the issue that dominates a campaign. And we simply don't know what the issues will be that will dominate the final 4 weeks of the campaign. Maybe it's taxes, maybe it's energy, maybe something will happen around the world, Afghanistan, another flood disaster, whatever. We simply don't know, but it matters, of course. And media, of course, play a role here too, because they are the ones that set, at least to a large extent, the agenda. And finally, I think personally that the shifts and changes that we have seen with respect to coalition politics in Germany are really the most significant ones that we have observed within, let's say, the last 20 years. And that's one of the points I would like to elaborate a little bit on. Maybe next slide. If you look at the 16 German states that we have in Germany, right now you have 13 different coalition formats in these 16 German states. And if, I don't know how closely all of you follow German politics, especially at the Land, at the state level, which is difficult sometimes, but in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, we might yet have another option that we haven't seen so far, namely a coalition of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and Liberals, black, red, yellow, gold, some would say, often labeled the Germany coalition, which I really don't like, but some use the term anyway. So that would make this slide even more complex, and we'd have 14 different coalition formats in the 16 German states. So this diversity in coalition politics really is a thing. It's real. You can observe it at the state level, and it has consequences, of course, because it makes campaigning quite hard. I mean, how can you campaign against a certain other party if that's your partner in some states and at some state levels and some state governments? And if you as a voter, if you really want to make a strategic vote choice in the end, maybe try to influence which coalition will form at the end of the day, I mean, it's a really complex, some would say impossible task. You have to make up your mind, what do you really want as a coalition? Then you have to think, well, maybe it's nice what I want as a coalition format, but is there a majority for that coalition format? Do the parties want that? And what do they say prior to the election with respect to coalition, possible coalition formats and how they sort of relate to that? Maybe you followed the so-called TRIL, which is an sort of an advancement of the duels, which is also interesting that we don't call them debates, but duels, but that's another story. But if you followed the debate on Sunday, you could see that the question, which coalition will form after the September election, is one that will also dominate the upcoming weeks. It's something that media journalists really like to talk about, that politicians hate to talk about. So that's an interesting dilemma here that we see. But people, issues, coalitions, there's volatility on all levels. And that's what makes this election so fascinating and so interesting. Because next slide and final part, I'll skip that for the moment. You as a voter, of course, only have one single vote. And all we've heard so far with respect to volatility means that you somehow have to integrate your Chancellor Preference, maybe your perceptions of the corona management, your perception of who's capable of maybe running an efficient climate policy, who's able to manage and handle climate change, what are the coalition preferences that I have, how does that affect my vote choice? At the end of the day, when you cast your vote, you have one single vote. And so what is the task from the perspective of parties, but also the task from the perspective of voters is, what is actually the defining criterion that I will use when I make up my mind, when I cast my vote on September 26th or even before that because of the higher share of postal votes? Next slide, maybe. If you want, yeah, that's the task, exactly, thank you. If you think that this election is all about who will be the successor of Angela Merkel, and if you think, as a lot of Germans do right now, that Olaf Scholz maybe is the best one, well, then you have to vote for the Social Democrats right now. But that rests on the assumption that you make a personal vote, that you basically cast an almost presidential chancellor vote, that your vote choice is based on your candidate perception. But that doesn't have to be the case. If you think that this election is about corona management or general perception of who is able to best run the country in the next 4 years, and you think of the figures that Peter has shown you, competence in a very broad and general sense, often inspired by Merkel, actually, who said, well, trust me, you know me, I will do my best to run the country, and just trust me, I will do that. Well, then maybe that is something that will in the end benefit Christian Democrats, CDU, CSU. If you think that this is all about climate change, that this is the very final election where we have a chance to sort of manage climate change, well, then you will have to cast your vote for the Greens. And the fascinating thing here, of course, is voters have all these perceptions and attitudes in their minds at the same time. They're highly ambivalent. So at the end of the day, what actually might turn out or cause the election to turn in one direction or the other is the question, what will ultimately be the criterion that voters will use? Is it about persons? Is it about management? Is it about climate? Is it about coalition? We don't know. That can still change. Psychologists call this the priming effect. What will ultimately be the prime that will lead voters to cast a vote in this or that direction? And so I guess all the three of us have said by now is that it's really fascinating, but to be honest, we all don't know how this election will turn out.
All right, thank you. Three wonderful presentations, and we have quite a few questions in the Q&A function, but maybe I'll post some questions first, also channeling some of the sentiments of our audiences. The first, I can't believe this is the first anything that I've done Germany related in 5 years where we haven't mentioned the AfD explicitly. So I'm thankful for that, because I think we mentioned them more than I would like. But I know that there were some rumors last time in 2017 that polling had underestimated support for the AfD. And I think everybody was surprised that they came in just under 13%. All the polling has them down a bit from their last election result. But I'm wondering if you think that support for the AfD is being underestimated. Secondly, we haven't talked so much about the FDP or the Linke. The Linke are down several points from their last election. I think everybody thought they were irrelevant, but now with a red-red-green coalition possibility back on the table, they're getting a little bit more attention. And then also the FDP. I mean, I remember it wasn't that long ago that people were worried they weren't even going to make the 5% threshold again this time around. But now they're up, what, 12, 13% in the polls. So why do you think the FDP is doing much better than they were a year or a year and a half ago? Maybe we'll, if you like, maybe we can just go through and have each of you maybe respond to some of these initial concerns. I'm starting with Dr. Schroth.
Yeah, concerning the AfD in 2016, 2017, the AfD was still quite a new right-wing populist party, and like all right-wing parties, it was initially difficult to capture via polls, and supporters either do not participate or do not honestly say what they will vote for. So after all, they are well-known phenomenons, and pollsters therefore has to learn to classify new right-wing parties and their poll ratings. We do, for example, random sample telephone interviews, and we still underestimate the AfD in our data. But what I have been observing lately is that online surveys, which with self-recruited participants, sometimes overestimate them. So I think it is therefore less a question of the methodology than of the correctly assessing the raw data to correctly assessing the raw data of the AfD, and less the question of a methodology. And to the FDP, the FDP had 12% in the last election and will achieve that again, especially because of the FDP gets votes from disappointed Christian Democrats voters, but not from his own strength, I think. And the Linke is difficult because I think no one wants to have a coalition with them because of their position of especially to behave with the NATO. So this will be an interesting point when it comes to coalition, you know what I mean, with them. Sorry, my English is so bad.
Not at all. Dr. Matushek or Faas, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sorry, nothing to add on the AfD issue. This is I share this this experience with the AfD. On the FDP as well. This is their strength is a little bit inflated due to disappointed voters from the Christian Democrats, which had always been the flux we saw in previous elections. The Linke is being a member of the Linke. I would be very worried because they really have a problem. I think something which has not been on the radar, as you said, Eric. Nobody has been talking very much about them lately because the focus is on other issues. But they are hardly have a 2 digits vote in the East, which had been their stronghold, also on the regional level in the latest election. And in the West, they really have become considerably weak. So their problem seems to be, especially in Eastern Germany, that their electorate is getting older, and which really causes them some problems, together with losing the status of a protest party in the East, partly to the AfD and so on. So it would be a sort of irony of history if they got into a coalition government now at their very weakest moment in many years. And I also think that looking at the issues, it's very hard to imagine a coalition containing the including the left party.
Maybe just a couple of comments. I mean, I think we will see quite a significant dynamic also on the level of these rather small parties. With respect to AfD, Yvonne has already mentioned the key points. Of course, we underestimate in a lot of samples support for AfD, but we probably know how to correct for it, at least if our usual correction measures work this time as well as they do or have done in the past. And that's, of course, something that can be the case. But given this huge amount of volatility that we have, that's something we don't know. I mean, we will see these record numbers of postal vote. We know that AfD voters have their issues with postal voting. I mean, you guys in the US know all about that, about populist and postal voting. And that's also something that adds uncertainty to this election. Fully agree with the remarks about the left party. They could really be in trouble at the end of the day, especially if strategic voting kicks in. I mean, if a vote for the left all of a sudden is considered as something that might at the end support Laschet, doesn't matter whether that's true or false as in factual sense, but then they really might be in trouble. But then at the same time, we've had an Allensbach survey. I don't want to get into a methodology discussion here, but published just 3 days ago, where the CDU-CSU was at 26%, the SPD at 24%. That's a majority for the current Grand Coalition. And that, I mean, I guess a lot of people would not want to see continuation of this Grand Coalition. So that, again, might trigger some dynamics, some movement from CDU, CSU, SPD to rather small parties. Again, just a lot of possibilities here, I'm afraid, that might still kick in the final weeks of the campaign.
All right, getting into some of the other questions. You know, for a long time, those of us who studied German politics were concerned or were interested in this whole notion of the Stammwähler. So like the party's, you know, real core supporters, the kind of base. And so there's a question about what the floor is, especially for the CDU-CSU. And I guess more generally, is there any such thing as Stammwähler anymore in the German system? Secondly, there's a great question here about how both the Greens and the CDU seem to have ended up nominating the less popular of the various options. And so, you know, are the parties doing personal polling, looking at the residents of a chancellor candidate choice before they make their decision of who they're going to put forward? And then I'm going to go down a question about kind of regional differences or different levels of support. I know that there were some elections where the vote in East Germany seemed to have been kind of decisive for who ended up winning. So are there any important East-West differences? And actually, more generally, I mean, who's going to take the East this time? And will that have any effect on the overall result? So, you know, maybe we could go in reverse order this time, starting with Dr. Faas.
Yes, thanks very much. I mean, if you just recall the figures we have seen, if you see the support that Olaf Scholz has, even among voters that still say that they want to vote for the Christian Democrats, you see that there is still potential for even these, I think it was labeled die-hard voters of the CDU, that they might sort of, at the end of the day, vote for another party. So I'd be very reluctant to say that they will receive at least X percent of the vote. It's simply just too much volatility here right now. I mean, it's not that voters in Germany behave like randomly, but they look at the options as the supply by parties, and within certain boundaries, they're just willing to vote for different choices. So it's not that they today vote for the SPD and then they vote for the AfD and then they vote for the Greens, but there is more openness definitely in that respect. With respect to the candidate question, it's kind of cheap to say that, because at the time the decision was taken, especially among the Greens, it's not the case that Robert Habeck was the more popular candidate in comparison to Annalena Baerbock. It's different for the CDU-CSU, but we have a different dynamic here because it's two parties at the end of the day. And the CDU, Armin Laschet, is simply It's the party that runs in 15 German states, and the CSU, Söder, is the Bavarian candidate. So there's just not a symmetric situation here. But for the Greens, they were really faced or level between Baerbock and Habeck. And I'm quite sure if Habeck was or were the candidate, he would have had a really hard time in this campaign too. I mean, we've read some interviews from him that have already, as the non-chancellor candidate, sparked considerable debates. I'm sure he would have made mistakes. So I'm not sure whether we'd be in a totally different position here. I mean, we don't know. Of course, it's completely hypothetical. Yeah, maybe I'll leave it with that here.
Dr. Matuschek?
Yes, I mean, talking about core voters, I think we have to have in mind what Thorsten just said, that people do not really switch randomly between the parties, and the amount of uncertainty we're talking about is often much due to or related to the question whether people will show up at the election day, or whether they will cast their vote. So there's also much usually much movement between voting for a party or going to the abstention. So this is something we cannot really measure. We know that there are many undecided, but we never know what the turnout will be. And I think the additional factor will be the postal vote in this election, which will be the highest in history probably. Talking about polling candidates before nominating them, to me, one of the most striking things in this campaign has been the nomination of Armin Laschet on behalf of the Christian Democrats, because you have to keep in mind that the Christian Democrats have always been the party mostly prone to power and to maintaining power. So for the CDU, which was called a Kanzlerwahlverein in the 50s, which was not an insult to them because they wanted to keep the chancellorship. This was their aim. So they might lose a local election or regional election, but maintaining the chancellorship on the national level was one of the most important goal. So they usually chose the person most likely to win this office. And now they decided in a vote of the party leadership of 60 people, maybe 60 persons, by a very narrow vote of 2/3 of them, to nominate Laschet, a candidate everybody knew. There were many polls before he was nominated that he was not the best candidate, and there was an alternative. So this is very interesting, and this is maybe a textbook case for how not to do it as a party. So if you do polling, just keep in mind what polls tell you. And in this case, it was very obvious. This was not a narrow margin. And if Söder ran in the election, the CDU would probably be above 30% without any doubt. So this is very interesting in this election. This is something we're used to looking at the Social Democrats. They chose a candidate more in line with their ideology or their program and so on, more pragmatic, programmatic party, and not so much a leadership oriented party. So I'll just leave it at this point.
And Dr. Schroth?
Yeah, let me add one idea. Laschet was already rated poorly before he was nominated as a candidate, and Söder was expected to be much better. But Söder, I think, embodied a kind of Merkel continuation in his habitus during the COVID pandemic. And I think the CDU, the Konrad Adenauer House, didn't want a continuation with a Merkel continuation. They want to get away from this Merkel habitus and this kind of Merkel politics. So I think this is the point why Laschet was nominated and not Söder, because they want to do a cut with Merkel, and Söder embodied a kind of Merkel. And no one in the party leadership but would have expected that the Christian Democrats to reach 22%, and neither I do, by the way. And but I think this is the flaw of the Christian Democrats Party. I think these are the Stammwähler, and on the other side, the 15% of the Social Democrats is signed the flaw over such a long time, and you know that now you see that the Social Democrats, as Thorsten said before, has potential, but I think not as much as they can't come over 25%. I do not think so, that the potential is so high. But this is, I think, the floor for the Christian Democrats, like the floor 15% is at the Social Democrats.
All right, we're rapidly running out of time, but I'd like to do one more round of questions if that's okay. So I guess the takeaway that I've had from all of our presenters today is just the high volatility. But do you expect the high volatility will last all the way to election day, or will you start to get self-reinforcing trends with the SPD up, the CDU kind of stagnant, and everything like that? So can we expect volatility all the way till September 26th? Secondly, there's a great question about whether we might expect a disinformation campaign, you know, with Russian or maybe even Chinese influencers trying to tip the balance one way or the other. And if we will expect this, how do you think that would affect the different parties' performance? And then, you know, maybe the final question is, if this is such an exceptional election, and if things are so close, is there anything that you would feel safe predicting at this point? Or is there anything that you think is extremely unlikely? Dr. Schroth, maybe we could start with you this time.
The thing which is extreme unlikely is that there is even more movement in the political mood than anticipated, and I would not have expected the Social Democrats to come anywhere near to the Christian Democrats, and so I think there's no safe answer for how the volatility will go. We have to see what impact the television debate had, and we have another television debate. So there is so much movement going on, and we have 4 weeks ago. So as I ended up with, this is the $1 million question, how this election will end.
Dr. Matuschek?
Yeah, nothing to add on this point. I think it's, yeah, we are looking week for week what is going on. Anything safe predicting? Yeah, the same thing. Disinformation campaigns, this is an interesting issue. I mean, we've been dealing with this in some of our polls, whether people were frightened or scared about this kind of campaigns. A majority is, although maybe Thorsten Faas knows more about this issue, I'm still struggling to imagine how this could influence a campaign in Germany, really, because you know, talking about social media, you have to put this a little bit into context. I mean, how many people really use this in Germany, these networks, for getting informed politically? How many people might be affected? How many people would believe this kind of fake news and so on? So there's a certain uncertainty among people when we ask them, but I'm still puzzled how this might play out in our context.
And Dr. Faas?
No, I agree. I mean, we've had a series of elections now at the federal level where in the run-up to the election, we heard that this time social media will clearly be the dominating factor. And so far, it never really has happened in Germany. We still see quite a significant reliance on quite traditional media, mass media, public media, also interpersonal communications. So I mean, it's an interesting comparison, but the room for social media and all the campaign, the information that is distributed there, it seems to be rather limited in the German case so far, and let's hope for the best that maybe it stays like that. Safe bet. Probably no party will have an absolute majority in the end. But maybe on a more serious note, I also think that we will not see a minority government, even though a lot of people talk about this, that at some point in time, a minority government might be a viable option in the German case. I don't see that, because the German constitution says that whoever wants to be a chancellor has to have a majority of members in the federal parliament, in the Bundestag. And that still somehow forces parties to form coalitions, even though it has become way more difficult. I mean, the time after the election will be as fascinating as the time before, probably. But I still think that at the end of the day, we will have some sort of stable coalition for the next 4 years.
All right, thank you so much. This has been just an amazing set of remarks from each of you today. I've learned a lot. There's still surprise after surprise after surprise. I never thought we'd be speaking about the importance of the TV trial or the other kind of television debates, which have never been that important for German elections in the past, but they might be this time. So thank you one more time. And to all of our audience members, I do want to mention that we have another event coming up on Thursday with an SPD candidate, Armand Zorn, who's one of the few candidates of color that is running for the Bundestag. So he will give us a report from the ground. So please do think about joining us on Thursday. And thank you for joining us today. And one more time, big thanks to our 3 panelists today. This was, really terrific. Bye, everybody.